John Piper says that murder, the desire to murder, is actually a desire for God. In the following quote I'm about to play, because Piper thinks unbelievers are still in the image of God and that God puts desires in them, he even has to be consistent with himself and to say that, well, when an unbeliever strives for anything, it's going to reflect, somehow it's going to reflect the image of God in him. So even the most perverse desire, the most perverse activities such as gladiators hacking themselves to death, he says that even this somehow must reflect the image of God in man. Here's what he has to say.
There is in the human heart an insatiable longing for beauty. And I am persuaded that the reason it is there is because God is the infinitely beautiful one and He made us for Himself. Even the most perverted desires for beauty, say the desire of people to relish the excellence of skill and strength and speed as gladiators hack themselves to death. Even that longing for beauty is a distorted remnant of something God put in the human heart that will not be satisfied until it is satisfied with God. We can know that these desires are from the Lord because we're unsatisfied until we find Him, the all-satisfying object.
So I suppose when the gladiators were killing Christians, when the Christians were fed to lions, those responsible for that were actually secretly desiring the God of the Christians. But when I bring this quote up, I'm actually having to deal with an objection that someone's brought against me. A guy called Arthur Bolet thinks I'm misrepresenting Piper, and I'll play you a quote from a video that Arthur's made where he challenges me to prove that Piper actually promotes idolatry. I think that Piper does promote idolatry because his idea that unbelievers should pray without faith, he exhorts them to cry to the Holy Spirit, and I'll play that quote after to further prove that Piper promotes idolatry. But by exhorting unbelievers to pray their way into salvation, to cry their way into salvation, since unbelievers don't have faith, since they're calling God a liar, since they're denying His promises, well, they are by definition, Piper's asking them to actually sin. He's commanding them to sin when he tells them to pray, because whatever's not of faith is sin. So their prayers will be sin. Piper's saying, pray without faith, pray your way into salvation, pray in your unbelief. He's not saying believe, then pray. He's commanding them to pray their way into salvation. So that's clearly teaching them, exhorting them to sin. But Arthur doesn't agree with me, and here's what Arthur had to say to challenge me on this point. Arthur says, Andrew Bain loves getting after John Piper. Bain says that Piper says that idolatry is a good thing. Now, if you've ever read Desiring God, where Piper talks about Christian hedonism and the idea that what is the chief end of man? To glorify God by enjoying Him forever. Well, apparently that's not really what Piper believes. Apparently, Piper really believes, according to Andrew, that we should not glorify God and not enjoy Him forever. We should glorify Asherah and worship Baal forever. Now, I do agree with Arthur that, yeah, look, Piper is a bit more subtle than that. He's not going around and saying to people, worship Baal, worship Baal. He's not that explicit, and I mean, even the Pope's not that explicit. I'm saying he's promoting idolatry in a bit more of in a slightly more subtle form, and it's all the more dangerous because of that. And if you look really carefully, or if you listen really carefully to the quote I'm about to play, you'll hear Piper saying that the Holy Spirit will not forsake an unbeliever if the unbeliever prays hard enough, if they cry hard enough, And you sort of wonder from the way Piper's preaching if they yell loud enough to the Holy Spirit, just in case God didn't hear. But yeah, Piper's sort of exhorting these unbelievers to yell and cry to the Holy Spirit as if, the Holy Spirit's kind of, oh, look, that unbeliever's crying so hard, I better save them. As if God kind of jumps back and all surprised, like, whoa, that unbeliever, he just wants to be saved so badly, I better save them. But it's not only salvation by works, because it's telling people they have to cry and, seize the Holy Spirit and take hold of Him in order to be saved, so that those that are saved, part of their salvation can be attributed to the fact that they cried and they followed Piper's lessons in how to be saved. Not only is it sort of salvation by works, you also kind of see the irrational, nonsensical side of the issue, as if, for example, dead people should pray their way into life, and you really wonder how the unbeliever can love God even to begin with. The gospel message is that many are called, few are chosen, that God has redeemed and purified a special people to Himself, as Titus says, that there's an elect people, a chosen nation, a royal priesthood, as Peter talks about. It's this very exclusive message that only Noah and his family were saved and the rest of the world were killed. With this kind of message that God only chooses a few to reflect that it's His choice, that He doesn't need, a man's not entitled to any kind of help or salvation. God doesn't have any sort of common grace, it's very particular. With this kind of message, I don't see how any unbeliever can have any love towards God at all. They have nothing to, they don't have the righteousness of Christ. How can they be crying, Abba, Father? How can they have a spirit of prayer, a spirit of thanks, of gratitude, of love, unless they first know that God loves them? But here's what Piper had to say.
And then there's a lesson for unbelievers. And the lesson for unbelievers is this: you must cry to the Holy Spirit. You must call out to Him, don't leave me. Have you ever thought what that prayer signifies? Don't pass me. Don't pass me. Open my eyes too. Soften my heart that I may give confession that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. Don't leave me, Holy Spirit. That's the way an unbeliever should pray. Come, break me. Make me open. Free me from my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. And I commend the gospel and the power of the Holy Spirit to you this morning. If you pray like that, He will not forsake you.
Now, Piper says that he's commending to men the power of the gospel and the power of the Holy Spirit. But is this so? He's telling unbelievers that they can approach God without a mediator, without Christ. They can tread freely upon the blood of Christ, tread it underfoot, and walk straight up to the Father without any mediator whatsoever. And he's saying that he is commending to them the power of the gospel. And what I find quite ridiculous and absurd about Piper's position is, as I was mentioning before, how can these unbelievers even love God? Luke 7 says, those who love much, why do they love much? Because they know they are much forgiven. Last couple of lines, her many sins are remitted, for she loved much. For to whom little is forgiven, he loves little. So the reason the woman loved much is because she knew her many sins were forgiven. So how can someone who has no idea, an unbeliever, they don't even know if any of their sins are forgiven. They have no knowledge of that because they don't understand the work of Christ. They don't understand what He's achieved for His people. How can they have any love at all? Likewise, 1 Peter says they're to pass the time of sojourning in fear. Why? Because they know that they've been redeemed with, not with corruptible things, but with incorruptible things. So it's all based upon the knowledge of salvation. The unbeliever doesn't know this, so I'm not sure how he can have any fear, knowledge, or love whatsoever.